The Frownzly Florgels by Fredric Brown. Oh, it was going to be a lovely Frowns. They all knew that. Nax had sent out the thought, and it had gone from star to star throughout the cluster. The competition as to who could go had been terrific. Everybody envied Nax, the agoraphobe, because he was the only one who didn't have to compete with 1,000 or 1,000,000 others to get there. But there was plenty of reason for that. Teppo got there first, except, of course, for Nax, who was there to begin with. Nax lived inside the planetoid Naxo, which once had another name, but for the several million years Nax had lived there, it had been Naxo, and the other name was forgotten. Nax had been a mutant Rogan, and, as was the custom, he had been teleported to a barren world and was abandoned to die. But he'd live. Indeed, he'd turned out to be practically immortal, and now he was the oldest and wisest of all, despite his peculiarities. He nearly starved for the first 1,000 years or so, until he was able to adjust his metabolism so he could eat the substance of which Naxo was made. After he'd eaten his way inside, he developed such acute agoraphobia that he could never come out again. He'd die if he did. Oh, everyone knew that Nax didn't have forever to live, because sooner or later he'd eat out the interior of the planetoid completely, and the crust would collapse, leaving him exposed, and he'd surely die. But that time was at least 10 million years away, and Nax was quite cheerful about it. Who wants to live forever? He'd clairvoy with a happy laugh. No one knew exactly what Nax was planning for this particular Frowns, but it would be fun. It always was. Teppo had teleported himself in a globule of liquid glass, his native element. He was going to have trouble, he knew, maintaining the temperature of the glass, and would have to use a part of his mind at all times to maintain the molecular vibration, but he'd still have enough mind left to enjoy the Frowns thoroughly. Being the first arrival, he didn't want to wake Nax if Nax was sleeping, so he floated around, looking down through the holes in the planetoid to see if the giant was stirring. The holes looked like craters, but really they were holes Nax had pushed through from inside so he could see and reach through, and so the methane could mingle freely inside the planetoid and without. Nax was still asleep, but Teppo could voy him beginning to stir. Teppo subvived a while to make the outside of his globule a reflecting surface. That way he could kill time waiting for the others by admiring the reflection of his sleek, finny beauty. He wriggled his tail and sighed with an ecstasy of admiration. When he high-vibed and made the surface transparent again, he was no longer alone. 2 others were there already. The cylindroid from Carambrontal floated smugly beside him, and one of the amorphous smoke cloud beings from Thal writhed lugubriously in the methane over one of the apertures of Naxo. While Teppo watched, the smoke cloud flowed into the hole to see if Nax was ready. The others were coming too. The grok teleported right in front of his eyes, in the egg, of course. Groks always returned to their eggs to teleport themselves off Hanta. Once they reached their destination, they cracked the egg from within and stuck their hideous heads out, preferring to remain that way until ready to return. Then they pulled in their heads and high-vibed until the egg was reknitted. No one ever saw a grok completely out of its egg off its own planet of Hanta. Teppo looked at the grok's head and was glad that he was beautiful. The disk creature from Omron and the sphere being from El teleported into sight together, and high in the violet sky the rocket trails of the ships of Zato and the Rang could be made out, both from backward planets which had not yet developed teleportation and the ability to adapt to any medium. They still depended on crude rockets for their interstellar travels. Annoying things the rockets would have been too, had they not, and of course their occupants, been so tiny. The smoke cloud being was now coming out of the planetoid, voying happily that Nax was getting ready. The cylindroid smugged with pleasure, and the two rockets went into ecstatic acrobatics, the one from Zato doing gay circles into and out of holes in the planetoid, and the one from Rang showing off its new inertialess drive by cutting impossibly sharp corners and worrying all the rest of them. Gira, the weirdly shaped thing from Garn, was next. Teppo averted his eyes from her body with its ugly protuberances. It would take him several glances to get used to her sufficiently to forget her monstrousness. She was of the race of Rogans, of which Nax was a mutant, but then the mutation was undoubtedly an improvement, and besides, one didn't have to look at Nax. Gira, the Rogan, cavorted gaily in the methane, happiest of them all. True, argon was her natural element, but it wasn't hard to adapt, and the anti-grav pseudo-thought of Nax made cavorting an ineffable pleasure. She caught Teppo's fishy stare and laughed. What did Nax have in mind for this frowns? Besides, of course, the Florgels. She was glad she wasn't a giant, like Nax, imprisoned in a planetoid, and that she didn't have to live in a molten glass world like Teppo. She was glad of everything, but especially of the fact that she'd been chosen to represent Raga, and that she was here. Who was missing? She looked around and counted. Well, not exactly noses, because she was the only one who had a nose, but she counted. They were all here, except two, and one of them, the spear spore from Gelf, appeared right while she was looking for it. A stupid thing, the spear spore. It had to materialize gradually after a teleportation. But at least it could teleport, and it was far ahead of most of the rest of them at glyphing. And then there was the other, the astroworld of the swarm, the tiny planetoid that was, life in itself. And they were all there, and Nax was voying a welcome, obviously having gragged the arrival of the astroworld at the very microsecond of its arrival. They were all there, and all joyous, and Nax was voying them gay welcome, and the frowns was on. The representatives of all the star cluster were there. Pretty soon the Florgels, but first Nax stuck his hand out with the book, and each of them rolled a thought at it, and the thought was recorded by the book, all except, of course, the poor little occupants of the spaceships from Zato and Rang. The occupants were too primitive, and had to relay their thoughts through the others for recording. Gara laughed at them tolerantly. The poor things couldn't even glyph. And then Nax pulled the book back, and the frowns really started. First, of course, the games. They played Ranzel, and Gara won that. They played a dozen other games, each more fun than the last, and because they were so diverse in their physical forms and mental capabilities, each of them managed to excel in something. They ended with the game of Merle, the best game of all, in Teppo's opinion. But maybe that was because he almost always won it, and he did this time too. But then he had an advantage at Merle, since it was played with the strings and hooks that his race used on their own planet to catch birds. They glyphed the hook into the air, baited with a koro, and pulled the birds down into the molten glass if they grabbed the koro. So Teppo was the one who managed to hook the Haga, an object shaped like a teacup, but used on Gara's planet to catch wings out of the Flug, which was alternately materialized and dematerialized in various places in the methane by Nax. Teppo was so proud of himself for winning the Merle that he kept the hook, string, and Haga materialized right through the Florgels after the games. The first few Florgels were old familiar ones, and then Nax voyed that he had something new for them to try. "We shall," he voyed, "try to contact another mind somewhere in the universe." "Oh, wonderful, Nax," voyed the spear spore. "How? Individually, or the group mind?" "The group mind. We'll all focus our thoughts through the book of Florgels." And he held the book out for them to focus on. He voyed his plan. They would all focus on the book, the thought of their group, just as it was. He would gram the thought two-way to the most distant galaxy they knew of, and attune it to a single mind there, if there turned out to be one. And in that mind, if it existed, would appear the picture of them at the Florgel. In their own minds, if the plan succeeded, would appear whatever thought picture was in the alien mind with which contact was made. Knox gave the signal, and they formed the group mind and focused on the book, and Knox groaned with the effort of his gramming across so many billion parsecs. But it was the worst Florgel they had ever tried, not because it didn't work, but because it did. It was horrible, the picture they got in return from that alien mind in the far galaxy. Gira covered her eyes as though that could shut out the awfulness of it. The cylindroid curled itself into a donut shape from shock, and the grok pulled its head back into the egg. But they all recovered gradually, and none of them voyed about it. They had all seen it, so there was nothing to voy about. And to enable them to forget quickly, Knox called another Florgel, the old familiar one of the nova and the Cepheid variable. Excerpts from a letter from Hannes Bok, artist and illustrator, New York, to Fredric Brown, writer, Taos, New Mexico. Lieber Fredric, remember that challenge we took up while you were in New York last fall, that you could write a story around any picture I could draw, no matter what, and that the rules of the game were to be that the scene represents actual existing conditions and is not to be explained as a dream, hoax, optical illusion, or insanity on part of the observer? Well, here's the picture. I suddenly got an idea for it out of the blue. Can these things be satellites? An egg, a gigantic coin, a free-floating drop of water with a fish inside, and if they are satellites, maybe you have a better explanation, can there be an atmosphere present? If not, how come the girl is having a high old time, cavorting in airlessness, and her with no insulated clothing or oxygen helmet? And if the cratered moon around which these wacky satellites revolve is barren, how come the huge hand sticking out of the crater and holding a book? How can it live with smoke coming out of another crater? Maybe it's smoke from the monster's pipe, but then how come the rocket shooting out of another crater? And what's the title of the book? Why is the fish dragging a fish hook on a line baited with an empty teacup? Remember that the rules are that every single point must be explained. With Frownzly Florgels, Hannes. Letter from Fredric Brown, Taos, New Mexico, to Hannes Bok, New York City. Dear Hannes, you didn't play fair. The picture is utterly impossible. Anyone who'd even try to write a story about it is crazy. Frownzly Florgels to you. Fred.